PFR Nation, it's Kevin Lao here, your host of the Planning for Retirement podcast, and welcome to this 89th episode of the podcast. Getting very close to the century mark, which is exciting stuff. It's hard to believe. This is going to be the second volume of the Q&A session. The first one, y'all really like that format. It's one of the top downloaded episodes in a 7-day span. So I took that information and I said, okay, we need to make this a recurring theme here and maybe do it every 5 or every 6 episodes. And now we just have a standing Word document in our Dropbox folder. And it's just questions that we're curating from Facebook pages, Reddit threads, client conversations, prospective client conversations that I'm having on the street with strangers that are asking me questions about retirement. Because if we get into it, that's just what happens in my life. But also, if you have a question, if you're in PFR Nation, you're like, hey, you know what? I want to submit my question. Don't be shy. You can email me at my work email. I'm not going to bite. I'm not going to add you to some sort of sales list and call you every day. But you can email me, and I'm not going to share your name. It's going to be a completely anonymous Q&A session if you listen to the first one. But you can email me, Kevin at imaginefinancialsecurity.com. And we will add that to our list, our Word document. And who knows, maybe it'll make it into a future show if it's a good one. But we've got some really good ones today that we're going to jump into. And we've got some questions about Roth IRAs, inherited accounts, IRAs to HSA rollovers, stock allocations as you're approaching retirement and what's appropriate. We're going to hit on 5-year rules for the Roth accounts. And then also we're going to talk about when to convert. When is the ideal time to convert to Roth? So some really great questions that we've got on our list today. There's 5, and I'm really excited to jump into it. But before we do, I just want to wish my oldest son, Tristan, I know he's not listening to this, but who knows? Maybe one day he will. He's going to be turning 6 on Saturday. So hard to believe. You know, my wife likes to say this, the days are long, but the years are short. And I hate that saying, but it is absolutely true. I think I hate it because it's kind of depressing. You know, it's like, yes, time flies. I get it. Stop reminding me. But it is the truth. And he's a 5-year-old that, yes, he's turning 6, but he's 5 going on 12, 13 years old. And the kid is already trolling me on a day in and day out basis. I mean, the kid today, as I'm going into my home office, and Tristan, all he's saying is, Daddy's obsessed with retirement. Daddy's obsessed with clients. I'm like, what is going on? I'm like, it's hard for me not to laugh at those comments because, the kid is just, he gets it. He knows Daddy is, when he goes into his office, he's on the grind and he needs to be focused. You can't come in here and just distract me because I'm not very happy about that. And with the summer, it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge transitioning from an office every day to a home office environment. But thankfully right now, my wife has the 3 boys and they are at the library today doing some things because it's so darn hot. And I think they're a little bit tired of the pool. They've been going to the pool so much this summer, which has been awesome. They love the pool. They love to swim. They're little sharks in the water. But, I think my wife, she's getting a little tired of the pool because you got the sunscreen, you got to pack the snacks, you got to pack some, their waters, drinks. And, it's a little bit exhausting for her. So I think she's like, I'm done with that. I want to do something inside because it's so darn hot. But anyways, happy early birthday to my son, Tristan. And we're really excited. We're going to be taking out a little boat on Saturday. We've got some family coming into town. So we're really looking forward to it. And, who knows, maybe do a little fishing. He's obsessed with fishing right now. And we in Hilton Head, I think I mentioned to this on a podcast before, but we had some fun little outings on the surf. We hooked we caught a cow nose ray. That was insane. We brought in a horseshoe crab, which was interesting. And then we also brought in a bonnet head shark. That was phenomenal. I feel like that one, the bonnet head, that had him hooked. And ever since then, he's been wanting to go out fishing. And, we got him a little rod from Academy Sports, a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle rod. And we've been doing a little fishing with that. He hooked a nice little bass on that thing, but it shook off at the last second. He lost it at the last second, which he was a little bummed about. But I had to remind him, I'm like, Tristan, we're not going to get out there and just catch a bunch of fish every single time. That's not how fishing works. Sometimes you get skunked, but it's okay. It's okay. Just be patient and good things will happen. It's very much like the markets. You have to just continue to stay disciplined, stick to your process. You got to, control what you can control. bring the right baits, get out at the right time, find the right spots, do your casting, do your little jigs in the water. But you've got to understand that sometimes they bite and sometimes they don't. And, with the markets, the same thing is sometimes we have uncertainty that we cannot control. And, the most important thing during that time of uncertainty is you don't want to react with emotion. You don't want to just completely change your fishing strategy just because they're not biting that day. Okay. And so I think it's very relevant to today, what's going on. I'm recording this on Friday the 1st, is that there's still a lot of uncertainty with tariffs. I think the markets have kind of sort of brushed off tariffs a little bit because they've sort of seen, the reality is like it's a lot of threats of tariffs. Yes, there are tariffs that are in place that weren't in place previously, but there are a lot of threats for tariffs. But then negotiations are happening, and deals are actually happening now, which is good to see. But lo and behold, we've got more threats of tariffs now, and particularly with Canada. This is going to continue for a while, unfortunately. So, I think overall the markets were okay with it because the labor market seemed to be strong. But now we've seen that, hey, the labor market may be showing a little bit of sign, some cracks, in the labor market. And so, with the jobs report that came out yesterday, 74,000 non-farm payroll jobs added in the month of June relative to the 104,000 that were expected to be added. So, not a very good jobs report. And unfortunately, the Fed, they elected to hold interest rates steady at the Fed meeting this past week. So, interesting that they decide that before they see the jobs report. Maybe they see the numbers before we see them. I don't know. I don't think so. I really think that, Powell is really using the data that we're also getting at the same time and making those decisions. So I think the likelihood of cuts beginning in September, I believe, has shot up quite a bit since these the job reports have come out. But I'm the concern is still the same thing. Tariffs, how they're going to impact inflation, and then ultimately how is that going to alter the course of the interest rates strategy that the Fed is going to put in place. There is still 2 to 3 cuts expected in the markets for 2025. So the expectation is that 2 to 3 times, beginning probably in September, the rate cuts will begin. But the hope is that it's not too little too late. If the economy is already slowing, we're potentially slipping into a recession or a contraction, right? At the very least. And, if the Fed's too late to the party with cuts, is that enough to save the economy from going into recession? Who knows? For our clients, we have a long-term play, so even if we do slip into a recession short term, we've got enough in the war chest in fixed income, cash alternatives, money that is not tied to the stock market. If they're going to be relying on that piece of the portfolio for, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4 years. Okay. We've got plenty of other assets that are not stocks that we can rely on. Okay. Because the worst thing you want to do is you don't want to just say, hey, you know what? We're going to go into a recession or these tariffs are going to blow up the economy. I'm going to move it all to cash, because if you're wrong, the stock market could rally very quickly, especially if the Fed does cut in September. All of a sudden, the markets could rally in anticipation of that. And you might be left behind sitting in cash. And now you're sort of waiting for the right time to get back in. It's like now you're waiting for the next correction, which that may not happen for another year or two or multiple years to come. So you don't want to try to guess what's going to happen in the short term. In the short term, the markets are very irrational. There's a very emotional, but long term, the markets tend to play out pretty well in your favor if you stay disciplined, if you stay invested according to your plan. That's why having a set investment allocation is the foundation of a good investment strategy. Okay. There are, 9,000 plus ETFs, mutual funds out there. There are not 9,000 Fortune 500 companies out there. In the S&P 500, we have essentially 500 companies in the S&P 500. So what does that tell you? A lot of these funds are investing in the same companies. There's a lot of redundancy in all these different funds. So there's more than one way to get to the desired outcome from an investment perspective. But the key is not blowing up your strategy because of an emotional decision, whether it's related to tariffs or interest rates or a recession, whatever it might be. Global, geopolitical concerns, with hopefully the wars, with Russia and Ukraine, there's always something to be concerned about. So I always talk about DERP, discipline, unemotional, repeatable process. That's what we like to follow. All right. Anyways, with that as a backdrop, why don't we jump into the first question? Okay, so the first question we're going to jump into is, do I have to take required minimum distributions from an inherited Roth IRA? So this is a great question because the Secure Act made a lot of confusing changes, really the 1.0 and the 2.0. 1.0 was passed in 2019, came into law in 2020. And the biggest change, to keep things really, really simple in this one is that back in the day, so 2019 or prior, if let's say mom had an IRA, and let's say she was 85 and mom passed away and left that account to her adult child. Let's say adult child was Johnny, Johnny's 60. Okay. Well, Johnny did not have to take out required minimum distributions based on mom's life expectancy, but on Johnny's life expectancy. So mom's life expectancy from the IRS viewpoint may have been like 7-8 years, whereas Johnny's life expectancy may be 26, 27, 28 years. So the life expectancy impacts essentially the amount that is required to take out on an annual basis. So inherited IRAs, or stretch IRAs was the term, were a very tax efficient way to leave money to future generations, because essentially the tax liability goes down at death, and then those distributions could be spread out for a much longer period of time than the initial account owner. So the Secure Act of 1.0 that was passed in 2019 eliminated this. So if you inherited an IRA in 2020 or later, you are now subject to the 10-year rule. Now, there are some exceptions, if you're a spouse or if you're disabled or if you're less than 10 years younger than the initial account owner. Like, there are some exceptions, but in general, if you're an adult child and your mom or dad leaves you an IRA, you're going to be subject to the 10-year rule. And one of the biggest question marks was, well, hey, are there still required minimum distributions on an annual basis for the inherited IRA during that 10-year? Because essentially the elimination of the stretch IRA, the new rule is the 10-year rule, which means the entire account has to be completely liquidated within 10 years. Okay, or by the end of that 10th year, I should say. So yeah, one of the questions was, well, could you just kind of delay all those distributions until the last, the final hour, year 10, and then take it all out? And the answer was unknown because the IRS wasn't really super clear, but they have since provided some guidance, and they've put out what's called this rule called at least as rapidly as. So essentially what that means is if you inherit an IRA, same setup, mom was 85, you're 60, you don't have to take out required minimum distributions based on mom's life expectancy, but you still have to take out required minimum distributions based on your single life expectancy. So you still have RMDs if mom passed away after her required beginning date, meaning after she was taking RMDs. If mom passed away at 60, she's not required to take out any minimum distribution. So therefore, there are no RMDs for the beneficiary, the adult child. In that case, Johnny would have been 35 instead of 60. So mom passed away at 60, Johnny inherits the account at 35. There are no RMDs for that traditional IRA. But if mom passed away at 85, she has required minimum distributions. So Johnny has to at least distribute the account at least as rapidly as, and then by the end of the 10th year, the account has to be completely wiped away at zero. Okay, so essentially it kind of puts a baseline of minimum distributions for the beneficiary during that 10-year window. And then at the end of that 10th year, the account has to be completely liquidated. But the thing about that, and I did a YouTube video on this on my on the YouTube channel, was, I most of the time I wouldn't necessarily follow that to the T, because it could result in a substantial tax liability in year 10. If you're just taking out the minimum, that could only be 3% or 3.5% of the account on an annual basis, which may feel great in those years 0 through 9, but then in year 10. Now you're having to wipe out the entire account balance, and it's probably compounded over and above what the initial account balance was. And that could potentially push Johnny into the 35 or even 37% tax bracket, depending on what kind of income he had. Now, there could be some reasons to do that. If, let's say, Johnny was in a super high tax bracket, he's in his peak earning years, and he's like, yeah, I'm planning to retire in 7-8 years. Maybe you do that. Maybe you take out the minimum and then wait until years 8, 9, 10 to get a little bit more aggressive with the distributions to completely liquidate the account by the end of that 10th year. But at the end of the day, a lot of the folks that we serve, when they inherit these retirement accounts, they may already be in retirement. And so their income is pretty known. They're not going to have a ton of fluctuations, maybe with required minimum distributions, but that's the opposite issue. they may have their own RMDs and down the road, maybe in 2 or 3 or 4 years. So they actually might get a little bit more aggressive with those distributions in the early years in order to smoothen out their income. But, I guess my point is you have to at least take out the minimum based on your single life expectancy for traditional IRAs. But what about Roth IRAs? Roth IRAs have no required minimum distributions. And therefore, the short answer on this one is there are no required minimum distributions during that 10-year rule, but the 10-year rule still has to be satisfied, meaning at the end of that 10th year, that account must be completely liquidated and go to zero. But the nice part is you can wait until year 10, take the whole thing out, and that account balance or that distribution will not be taxable because it is inside of a Roth account as opposed to a traditional. So in short, there are no minimum distribution requirements for Roth inherited IRAs, okay? But for traditional IRAs, there are some RMD requirements, and you need to kind of think about the timing relative to what's required and also compare that to what your income situation is going to be. Your tax liability is going to be not only short term, but also over the next 10 years. Now, one of the nuances, we just talked about Roth IRAs on this one, is what if the money's in a Roth 401k or Roth 403b? Okay. The Roth 401k and Roth 403b portion does not have a required minimum distribution. All right. So technically speaking, there's no RMD for the beneficiary. There shouldn't be an RMD for the beneficiary. But, again, don't quote me on this one because this is a little confusing on this piece. But the catch is if there's any money inside of a traditional portion of that 401k or 403b plan, let's say you have a mix of Roth and traditional, which is more common than not. I mean, most of the time, if you're contributing to a Roth, even if you're going all in Roth, maybe your employer matches you 3% or 5%. Generally speaking, all of those contributions that they match you will go into the traditional tax deferred portion of that 401k or 403b. So the catch is if any amount of that 401k or 403b is inside of that traditional portion, the Roth portion could also be subject to those annual quote unquote RMDs during that 10-year period of inheriting the account. So kind of a nice little like planning tip there is if you've got Roth balances in a 401k and 403b and they're eligible to be rolled over into your Roth IRA, it probably makes sense to do that as soon as you're eligible to do that. That way you can isolate that money, separate that money from the pre-tax portion of your 401k, 403b, put it inside of the Roth IRA. And also, hopefully you've already started that 5-year clock, which we'll talk about here in a second. But that's a nice little planning tip. And that way, the money, if and when you pass away, that money goes to your adult children or whoever your beneficiaries are, and the money is inherited in that Roth IRA, which we've already talked about, have no required minimum distributions, not only in your lifetime, but also during that 10-year roll period. Hopefully that helps. All right, the second question is, I've heard you can roll over funds inside of a traditional IRA into an HSA or health savings account. How does that work and when might it make sense? All right, this seems like a really like sexy question on the surface. Like, oh, you can move money from a traditional IRA to an HSA. Traditional IRA, typically the funds are tax deferred. And when you take them out, then they're going to be taxable. Whereas an HSA, the money is going to be tax free as long as they are used for qualified healthcare expenses. Okay. So on the surface, like, oh yeah, this sounds really, really great. What a great planning opportunity. But there are some things you need to take into consideration. The first thing is it's a once in a lifetime option. So it's not something you can do on an annual basis. Okay. The second thing is the amount is limited to your annual HSA contribution for that year. So for 2025, it's $4,300 if you're on a single plan, like if you're on a health plan that just covers you. If you're on a family plan, then it's $8,550 for the contribution amount for that year. And then there's $1,000 catch up if you're 55 or older. Okay. The third thing is you must be HSA eligible, meaning you must be covered by a high deductible health plan during that period of time. Okay. So this is a big deal. Like if you left your employer, you were on a high deductible healthcare plan, you have a traditional IRA, you have an HSA, but now you're on this new plan that's not a high deductible healthcare plan. You can't do that. You can't do that rollover. Okay. But the nice thing is, the benefit is, instead of that traditional IRA distribution being taxable like it normally would be, the traditional IRA rollover to the HSA would not be taxable. Okay, so that's not taxable to you during that year. And now the funds can grow tax-free inside that HSA and be withdrawn on the back end. tax-free if they're used for qualified healthcare expenses. Okay. And one nuance on this one is that the funds must come from an IRA, not a 401k or 403b. So technically speaking, like if you wanted to do this strategy, but you don't have an IRA, but you have a 401k, you could roll over those funds that you wanted to do the rollover to an IRA first. Let's say you wanted to max that out and you're on a family plan of 8550. Plus, maybe there's $1,000 catch up of $1,000 catch up. So 9550, you could roll over that 9550 from your 401k into an IRA, isolate those funds into an IRA, and now that IRA is eligible for that once in a lifetime opportunity to roll over to a health savings account. Okay. Now, one of the kind of the key gotcha issues with this as well is if you're close to being Medicare eligible, and then all of a sudden, once you enroll in Medicare, okay, now you are not eligible for a high deductible healthcare plan, and there's a 12-month testing period. So once you do the rollover for at least 12 months, you need to still be eligible for that HSA contribution via that high deductible healthcare plan. So if you do the rollover right before you turn 65 and then you get on Medicare, that could result in an early withdrawal penalty and also taxes on that HSA distribution. So really important to note that you've got to follow these rules. But, kind of in practice, I was thinking about this. Is like our clients that we serve, at least in our practice, most of them have the cash and the funds to just contribute to the HSA outright. And they'd rather just do that and get the tax deduction for those contributions in that year. Certainly you can look at the IRA as, that's kind of a tax deduction because normally you would pay taxes on that IRA distribution. Now it's in the HSA, it's tax free. So sure, you could look at that as a tax deduction, but with an HSA contribution, you're actually reducing your taxable income for that year. And if you had the funds to contribute and max out the HSA, like when would this actually come into play? I think in reality, it could come into play if like you had some life-changing event, like maybe you're paying for college tuition, for 2 kids. Like, I'm thinking about myself, like, okay, my twins, when they're in college, my oldest son's going to be a year older. Like I'm going to have 3 kids in college at the same time, probably for at least 3 years, hopefully 3 years. And that's it. But anyways, expenses might be a little high at that point in time. So maybe I'm not able to make a contribution into my HSA that year. So instead I could use this IRA rollover option. Again, it's only a once in a lifetime thing. But it is out there. So it could fit for some of you. And that was our question number 2, but hopefully that is helpful and hopefully that addresses this. But again, HSAs, one of my favorite vehicles to use for retirement planning because of the triple tax benefit. You've got the tax deduction on the front end, much like a traditional 401k, no taxes on the growth and earnings, just like any IRA, any 401k. But then you've got Roth-like distributions as long as those distributions are used for qualified healthcare expenses with the HSA. So it kind of acts like the Roth IRA on the growth and the distributions, but then a traditional 401k for those contributions. Very, very unique in the retirement planning world. All right, question number 3 is, we have 90% of our 401k in equities to make up for lost time, but retirement is only 5 to 7 years away. What's a more conservative allocation we should consider? And then the follow-up to that is, does the 110 minus your age rule still hold up? Lots of great points in here. The first thing I want to point out is this idea of making up for lost time. 90% of the 401k in equities, I'm not 100% certain what this person's age was. Okay. Cause this is actually a question that we pulled off a Facebook group, but let's say this person is 55, right? 55 or maybe 60 years old. 90% in a 401k may or may not be suitable depending on their time horizon in which they're going to retire. If they plan to retire in a year, that's a very different story than if they plan to retire in 5 years or 10 years. If the answer is maybe closer to 5 or 10 years, 90% of equities, that doesn't concern me because of my risk tolerance, but that may concern you based on your risk tolerance. Like if you see, 90% of your 401k is in equities, and even if you have a 5-year horizon, a worst case scenario, 2008, 2009 type of drop, you could experience 35 to a 40% drop in your portfolio. So if you have, let's say $2 million, that could turn into $1.3 million very, very quickly with a 90% 401k. Now, obviously, this is assuming a worst case scenario, the worst market we've seen since the Great Depression, but that's what we want to stress test. At least as a financial planner, I want to stress test, hey, what's kind of that worst case scenario and can you live with that? Again, if it's a 5-year horizon, hopefully it recovers. 2008 did recover in 5 years. Okay. It took a little over 4 years, but if the recovery is longer, that's a concern. Or if retirement's shorter than 5 years, that's a big consideration, is the time horizon in which you can begin that retirement. But I think another thing is, you think about, okay, what is an appropriate allocation? Let's say 90% isn't appropriate. Maybe this person's on the brink of retirement in a year or two, and maybe they've done some catching up over the last 5 years. 2021, solid year for stocks. 2023, 2024, both solid year, good years for stocks. 2022, not a great year for stocks or bonds. Okay. But we had those in there every 4 or 5 years. But let's say that wasn't an appropriate allocation based on their goals, based on their risk tolerance. I think back to the 4% rule. I referenced the 4% rule quite a bit, where Bill Bengen, he advocates a minimum of 50% equities. And that's what he used to actually stress test the 4% rule. 50% in the S&P 500, 50% in U.S. Treasuries, 30-year Treasury bonds. He advocated a minimum of 50% in equities, but as close to 75% as possible. Okay. Now, not everyone has that risk tolerance to go 75% in stocks, even in retirement. But he advocated as close to 75% as possible, which I like that. You think about the 60-40 traditional portfolio of 60% stocks, 40% bonds. I think that held up really, really well for many, many years, many decades. But I think we're seeing the downsides and the limitations to that, particularly in the bond market. The bond market has not performed like it had performed in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It's been very lackluster since 2008, 2009, when interest rates went essentially to 0%, quantitative easing for a prolonged period of time. So 60-40 portfolio has not been super favorable for retirees. So if we can get closer to 70, 75% in equities, I like that. But it's got to be comfortable for you specifically, because you're the one that needs to tolerate your potential portfolio values going up and down. But I'll reference that point as another kind of food for thought. There is he liked as close to 75% as possible to equities. I think another consideration as well is, how much risk capacity do you have? Okay, like as an example, if you have, let's say, Social Security and a pension, right, and maybe that covers 80% of your income needs in retirement. So only 20% needs to be, you only have a 20% gap in your expenses that you need to rely on your investment portfolio. And let's say that translates into a very low rate of withdrawal. Maybe you only need to take out 2% of your portfolio on an annual basis to true up that gap. We have clients like that, where they worked for many years. They have military pensions or government pensions or teachers' pensions. And, it covers a good chunk of their day-to-day living expenses and some of their discretionary expenses. And they only need to take out 1%, 2%, or sometimes 0% of their portfolio. They actually have the risk capacity to take on as much or as little risk as they really want to. We've talked about this before. So risk capacity is very different than risk tolerance. Risk tolerance is, how are you feeling when the market goes up and down? Risk capacity is, let's stress test your plan and what's your required rate of return. And because of those factors that I just mentioned, Social Security, pension covering 80% of their expenses, that individual in that example, they actually have the capacity to go as aggressive as they want, meaning, hey, we won the game and we can actually have the opportunity to leave a multi-generational legacy. So let's take on more risk, because that compounding over the course of 20 to 30 years, being 90% in stocks is a much greater than the compounding being 60% in stocks. They have the capacity to do so. They earn that right to do so. On the flip side, they have the capacity to take on less risk, meaning they could essentially kind of totally ignore the 4% rule and Bill Bengen's 50% minimum and say, you know what, I'm going to go 100% in the bond market or fixed income or laddered CDs or treasuries, or 100% in cash, because I only need to take out 1 or 2% of my portfolio. And therefore my required rate of return is only maybe 3% to adjust for inflation over time. So therefore they have the capacity to take on more risk or less risk if they wanted to. Whereas someone who, let's say, more traditional example, maybe they have Social Security but no pension. Okay, now they need an annual withdrawal rate, let's say closer to 5% or 5.5% or 6% a year, which is still doable in many scenarios. But now your required minimum equity exposure has to at least be 50, probably closer to that 75% level. So the risk capacity conversation is very, very important to also match up with the risk tolerance question. But I guess kind of my plea to you, my action item for you is stress test your plan. Like, see how your long-term plan works in higher required rate of returns versus lower required rate of returns versus versus relying on some sort of like arbitrary formula of 110 minus your age. Like, I just think those are just not good strategies to kind of go with a benchmark, because the asset allocation, your investment allocation, is a big factor in determining your long-term rates of return. And I think, things like your personal rate of withdrawal, your risk tolerance, your risk capacity, all of those are really going to play into what the optimal investment allocation is going to be between stocks and bonds. Number 4, can you explain the 2 different 5-year rules for Roth IRAs and how they work for inherited IRAs? Okay, the 5-year rule, this gets really confusing, truthfully, even to me at times, but there are 2 different 5-year rules. And I guess to kind of like really highlight the 5-year rule overall, it's basically when your Roth IRA, not your contributions, but your earnings, those potential earnings and conversions, will be exempt from taxes and potentially excluded from the 10% early withdrawal penalty. So I guess to kind of really the starting point is there are 2 different 5-year rules. One is for contributions, one is for conversions. Okay. Let's start with, I think, the simpler one, which is the contributions. Essentially, you contribute to a Roth IRA and those earnings are, there's no tax deduction for it. So it's an after-tax contribution. But once you make the contribution, that 5-year clock begins. Okay. And then the 5-year clock, what the impact there is, when you take the withdrawal on the back end, you want to experience tax-free withdrawals. That's why you get into the Roth IRA to begin with. In order to do so, you must satisfy 2 different tests. Okay. Number 1 is the Roth IRA must be around for at least 5 years. So if you made a contribution in, let's say, 2020, you're good to go. Your Roth account has been around for 5 years. You've satisfied the 5-year rule. Now, you could technically still make a contribution for 2024. We're talking about 2025. So 2024's tax season up until the tax filing deadline, April 15th of 2025. So technically speaking, you can make the contribution in a year after the tax year. So technically you could probably get funds out tax-free within 5 years, if that makes any sense, because of like the timing of the contribution deadlines versus the actual tax year you're making those contributions for. But that's the first requirement, is the Roth IRA must be around for at least 5 years, 5 tax years. Now, the nice thing is they aggregate everything together. So if you do have multiple Roth accounts for whatever reason, the first one, that starts the 5-year rule that we're talking about here. The second part, in terms of making that distribution tax-free in terms of the earnings, is that you must be 59 and a half or older. So this is just like the IRA early withdrawal penalty. So the Roth account, same thing. In order for it to be tax and penalty free, it must be at least 5 years, and you must at least be 59 and a half or older. So your contributions, you don't have to worry about, hey, if emergency popped up, you make a contribution to a Roth over time, or maybe you made contributions to a Roth over the course of 2 to 3 years, but then you needed to take those funds out just in case of an emergency. Those contributions are actually tax and penalty free. It's a return of your basis. So there is a way to get out your capital for that first rule, that first 5-year rule. Again, it's the contribution rule. We're really just talking about the earnings over and above those contributions. For the earnings to also be withdrawn tax-free, you must have that 5-year rule and 59 and a half. Now, conversions are a little different. Each conversion has its own 5-year clock in order to avoid the 10% penalty. Okay. However, an exception is made once you do turn 59 and a half or older. So it really only applies to individuals that are younger than 59 and a half, and they're doing conversions. This is really for the early retiree crowd that are, they plan to retire, let's say 55, and they plan on maybe all of their assets are in tax deferred vehicles, and they're like, hey, I want to get these funds out without paying a 10% penalty. Let's do a bunch of Roth conversions and I can get out my basis tax free. That's what this rule is really for, to protect against doing a conversion to Roth. And then you're like, hey, I've had the Roth for 5 years because I made contributions back in the day. Maybe they had some money in the Roth account. Now they're doing all these conversions and now they're trying to get these funds out penalty free because they're younger than 59 and a half. You can't do that. Each 5-year conversion has its own 5-year clock. Okay. So really important to note, but really the question here was, how does that work for inherited Roth? So we talked about inherited Roths before, how there are no required minimum distributions. Well, if the Roth account had not been open for 5 years and, those requirements were not met, the 5-year rule carries over for that beneficiary, in short. Okay. Now there are complexities, whether if it's a contribution versus a conversion, but essentially the 5-year rule carries over to the beneficiary if that individual passed away, if the initial account owner passed away and left that Roth account to the beneficiary. You would need to take that into consideration before taking any distributions out, because they could be subject to taxes, ordinary income taxes, when in fact you want to have a Roth to have tax-free withdrawals. Yeah. So outside of the early withdrawal, 59.5 or older, that's an exception to the 10% penalty. There's also death, disability, or first-time home purchase. So, those also apply, but you have to just take this into consideration for whatever it's worth. And again, it's probably not going to apply to a lot of individuals, because most individuals, when they're making contributions or they're making conversions into the Roth, at least the clients we serve, we try to make that Roth account their later bucket, almost kind of their last line of defense. And there are other ways to tap into traditional IRAs or traditional 401ks to avoid the 10% penalty. Okay. If you are planning to retire before 59.5, I think there are better ways to go about tapping into your funds than doing this Roth conversion window ladder that many people talk about. All right. Last but not least, number 5 is, when is the best time to convert to the Roth IRA? All right. So I did a YouTube video on this on the YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel was called "Don't Miss Your Roth Conversion Window." So if you've been listening to the podcast, if you follow the YouTube channel, if you're a subscriber to the YouTube channel, you know that the Roth conversion window is essentially the time period after you stop working and your earned income goes down to either a very low amount or potentially to zero. So therefore, your taxable income should go way down, and maybe you don't have a pension, and maybe you're just relying on distributions from non-retirement accounts, maybe a taxable brokerage account, or maybe a money market account, or a CD that you have, and you're going to use that for income for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Okay. And then start taking Social Security, or then later on taking required minimum distributions. Well, that Roth conversion window is the time upon retirement until you start taking required minimum distributions, which for some of you will be 73. Many of you will be 75. If you're born 1960 or later, it'll be age 75. So if you retire at 60 and your beginning date for required minimum distributions is 75, you have a 15-year Roth conversion window where it could make sense to do Roth conversions. Now, I should say, now I'm not saying do Roth conversions just because you're in the Roth conversion window. And this was one of the points that I made on that YouTube video was, Roth conversions, I feel like they're almost kind of like, it's like a mainstream advice now. And so everyone's just talking about Roth conversions, which 3 out of our 5 questions here were related to Roth conversions. So I guess I'm a hypocrite there, but I'm talking about it because a lot of our clients are asking about this. I had lunch with a guy the other day who's 65, and he asked this exact question. It was like, hey, when should I start converting to Roth? And I told him, when you're in that Roth conversion window, when you go to part-time work later this fall and then transition into retirement, and then until you turn 75, you're going to have basically a 10-year window of a Roth conversion window. But that doesn't mean you should convert. It depends on many factors. It depends on what other assets you have, what other income sources you have to pay those taxes, the timing of Social Security, your legacy goals. Who's going to inherit your accounts. If your entire IRA is going to charity when you pass away, why would you convert anything to Roth? You should just leave everything in tax deferred. You pay the taxes, and then when you pass away, that money is going to go to charity, and they don't pay taxes on that IRA. Okay. Or when you start taking minimum distributions, you can now direct some of those minimum distributions over to the charities that you want to gift to during your lifetime via the qualified charitable distributions. On the flip side, if you're like, hey, you know what? Conversions do make sense. My son or daughter, they're in a super high tax bracket. They're entrepreneurs, or they're doctors, they're attorneys, they're already in the 32% bracket. So if I leave them this money, now that's going to push them up to the 37% bracket, and they pay state income taxes, and they live in California, and they live in New York or New Jersey. So I want to do these conversions at my tax brackets to maximize the tax efficiency of that legacy. Then you probably want to really consider Roth conversions. Now you need to consider the timing. And I like that framing of the Roth conversion window is the starting point. Okay. Upon retirement, earned income goes down, tax bracket goes down. And now we've got this period of time before you start taking Social Security, before you start a pension, before you start taking minimum distributions from your IRAs or 401ks, in which those Roth conversions could make a lot more difference. You can kind of hammer away at a lot more of those conversions during those years. Not saying you shouldn't do conversions outside of the window. Even though you're taking minimum distributions, let's say at 75, maybe you're only at the 22% bracket and your son or daughter is going to be in the 37% bracket when they inherit that account. So maybe you still want to continue to fill up the 22% bracket or the 24% bracket. Crunch those numbers and decide, hey, do Roth conversions make sense continuing past my Roth conversion window? The answer might be yes. You just need to figure out at what level, what bracket do you want to convert to? And again, thinking back to what are we solving for? Like, who are we planning for? Is it just for your lifetime? Is it for your lifetime plus a spouse? Maybe you've got a younger spouse who you're more than likely to outlive. And so you're also trying to think about, hey, if I pass away, my spouse may have 15, 20 years filing taxes as a single taxpayer, unless they get remarried, of course. And the tax brackets applied to the single taxpayer, a lot less favorable than it is to applying to a married couple. So that could be another reason to do Roth conversions. But again, the timing of it, in my opinion, is that Roth conversion window sweet spot. And that's what I'd recommend really as a starting point after you've determined, yes, conversions make sense for me. But that's the key. They may not make sense for all of you. But I guess I really quick, I'll also point out, just be careful with some other hidden tax traps, with doing conversions, especially with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I just mentioned this in the last podcast episode, is that when you're doing these conversions, especially if you're over 65, you need to really consider the potential phase out or elimination of the senior bonus deduction. Once you're turned 65, you're eligible for $6,000 on top of your standard deduction as a senior bonus deduction. Okay. And that is phased out once you're single and you earn $75,000 a year of modified adjusted gross income. And then married couples, it's $150, but then that phases out completely at $175 and then $250. Okay. So if you're doing aggressive Roth conversions and you're maxing out that 24% bracket, that can completely wipe away, even the 22%, that could completely wipe away or minimize that senior bonus deduction. So you really need to take that into consideration, particularly for the years from 2025 through 2028 when that senior deduction is available. Who knows if that'll get extended past 2028? I guess the next president will figure that out. But you need to watch out for that one. And of course, watch out for things like taxes on Social Security, the Medicare surcharge that we always talk about is IRMA, income related monthly adjustment amount. Or if you're younger than 65 and you're doing the healthcare exchange and you're eligible for some tax credits. Okay. So you're buying in health insurance policies and you're like, hey, this wouldn't be affordable unless I got these tax credits. Well, we already know now that the cliff is coming back in 2026, meaning once you hit 400% of the federal poverty line, you're no longer eligible for those tax credits on the ACA policies. So you really need to kind of take that into consideration, because the last few years, we've had this gradual decline in the ACA tax credits. Now it's a complete cliff. And if you're doing Roth conversions in your early 60s, that could really impact the amount you receive on ACA subsidies. So lots of nuances, lots of complexity there. But in general, that's my recommendation, is to consider that Roth conversion window first, then kind of look at some of those hidden taxes, right? So I guess, no, really first, does it make sense to convert? Then look at when you should convert, then figure out what bracket you're trying to target and maximize during your lifetime. And that's going to depend on many factors. And then take into consideration some of those other hidden tax traps like the IRMA thresholds or the senior bonus deduction or the ACA premium tax credits. All right, that was a lot of information, I know, but I hope y'all found it helpful, and I really enjoy doing these formats. So again, if you have questions you want to submit, email me directly. I will not bite. Kevin@imaginefinancialsecurity.com. And of course, consider, if you have not already, following our podcast. If you're in that threshold, that PFR Nation threshold that I mentioned earlier, and then also make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And thanks so much for all of you that have left 5-star reviews for our podcast. It really helps us reach more people, impact more people, which is what we're looking to do here on this podcast. But we also love to help people one-on-one. This is what we do. This is what I do on a day in and day out basis. We love helping people plan for and execute a successful retirement, maximize their retirement spending, minimize their lifetime tax bill, and worry less about the financial markets. If that describes you and you're like, hey, you know what? I'd love a second set of eyes on what I'm doing. you can visit our website at www.imaginefinancialsecurity.com to learn more about working with us, or you can just go straight away and fill out the retirement readiness questionnaire that is linked in the description of the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear from listeners, learn a little bit more about what you're looking to accomplish and how we can help, and see if it's a good fit for us to work together. Until next week, thank you so much for tuning in. And this is Kevin Lao signing off.